Welcome everybody, my name is Ciarán O'Neill. I'm Deputy Director here at Trinity Longroom Hub, which is Trinity's flagship Arts and Humanities Research Institute. It's my pleasure to just open this session, welcome you all to it, and in a short while I'm going to be handing over for a conversation between Professor Frances Flannery, James Madison University, Professor of Religion there, who's been here on one of our Trinity Longroom Hub fellowships for the last few weeks and has settled in, I hope, and gotten to meet most of the community here at this stage already. Frances is going to have a conversation with Dr. Jacob Eriksson, who lectures in theological ethics here at Trinity College Dublin, connected to the Loyola Institute since 2016. So, Jacob, I'm going to allow you to introduce our speaker and welcome everybody, and there'll be a chance for questions at the end.
Okay, feedback. Welcome to all of you who are here, and for all of you who are streaming at whatever time you do stream this later. I'm Jacob Eriksson, as was just introduced. I'm an assistant professor of theological ethics in the School of Religion, Theology, and Peace Studies, and I get to be here with Dr. Frances Flannery of James Madison University, Harrisburg, Virginia? Harrisonburg. Great. And I'm going to just read a little bit of your bio, as is because I think it captures a bit of the multidisciplinarity that is really exemplified in your work, and one of the reasons why I'm really glad you're here. So Professor Flannery is a dedicated teacher who teaches in the area of Hebrew Bible, Judaism, religious terrorism, religions of the world, religion and animals, and religion and the environment. It's a wide range, and we'll get into all of that, I'm sure. She was a 2014-15 state finalist for the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award, and 2012-13 recipient of the Carl Harder Distinguished Teacher Award for the College of Arts and Letters at JMU, which says something about your interdisciplinary and your dedicated teaching as well. And so you teach in ranges of things: religions of the world, Hebrew Bible, Judaism, angels, demons, and dreams in early Judaism and Christianity, apocalypticism, terrorism, religion and animals, Jewish mysticism, experiential teaching, and thinking about the historical and contemporary issues involved. So we're really glad to have you here, and I've been really grateful to be in conversation with you over the last 2 weeks, and looking forward to more of that. I think maybe one of the better places for us to start in this kind of interdisciplinary space, as we're is about our discipline and the question around it. Whenever I tell someone I'm a professor of theology or religion, the first question I get is maybe not necessarily what do you study, but are you religious? And so maybe say a little bit about why religion, what religion, study of religion does for you, and where you go with that. Why is it important?
I agree, that's a great place to start, because usually when I tell people what my title is, they start confessing to me the last time that they've been to church, and it really doesn't matter to me. So I'll take the name of your school at Trinity College, but first I want to thank you, because our conversations have been wonderful, and I'm hoping to pull Dr. Eriksson, or I'll call you Jake, into this conversation more, so that it's not just me answering, because we've had the most fabulous conversations, just incredibly stimulating time, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Trinity Longroom Hub, because this research fellowship has been transformational. I'll start with the name of your school here at Trinity College, the School of Religion, Theology, and Peace Studies. That's correct, right? Because there is some opaqueness there for people who are not on the inside of that. The hub here is an interdisciplinary hub of arts and humanities and everything else that we bring into that. The study of religion itself is interdisciplinary. Even in biblical studies where I'm concentrating on antiquity, this involves history, it involves linguistics, it involves sociology, anthropology, it can involve anything that you really bring to it: anthropology, neurobiology, medical anthropology, etc., etc. And it is just resolutely interdisciplinary as a discipline. And so that is different than some other fields, and it lends itself to interdisciplinary thinking and interdisciplinary work. So it's not surprising to me that a lot of people who have floated in their long careers from major to major and discipline to discipline find themselves in religious studies or the study of religion, because it draws people like us. And then we have a tendency to do projects that are wide-ranging. Now, even in biblical studies, and I'm a biblical scholar, there is sort of a kind of approach, even in that interdisciplinary work, to say, since we're studying antiquity, let's stay free of bias, let's stay completely objective, let's use these tools of biblical scholarship, historical criticism, literary criticism, where we're reading the biblical texts as they were in antiquity, trying to discern the original meaning of these texts. And let's not bring in anything having to do with the contemporary world. Let's not bring in anything relevant to our contemporary lives. Let's keep it separate, right? Let's keep theology out of it, in other words. But in that name, again, religion, theology, and peace studies, theology has a little bit of that as well, because one can do systematic theology in which you're studying the history of what this theologian thought, what this theologian thought, what this theologian thought. Or you could do something more like constructive theology, and you identify as a constructive theologian, right?
Yeah.
Could you say a word about that before I move on to peace studies in that title?
Oh yeah, that's a good question actually. Rather than simply reflecting or repeating theological doctrines or stories as they've been told through history, I think constructive theology is an approach that links up with some of yours in some ways of asking how some of these theological histories impact on the present and how we might retell some of those stories differently or bring up sort of forgotten histories to address things like gender and climate change and all of the ethical questions, I think, just heavily concerned with the present. So it's an acknowledgement that theologians don't simply reflect on theological ideas as if they exist as timeless truths. We do theology, we make theological reflection, just as a philosopher makes philosophy, or a literary scholar makes literary theory, we make theology in some ways, and so it brings the human part of it back into it quite a bit.
Exactly, because as a human interpreter, you're always going to have a role. So even as a biblical scholar, I have these tools, historical criticism, literary criticism, linguistics, etc., but it's still dependent upon me to see what I see and to use that tool. And in terms of our topic today, which has to do with ecological readings of the Bible, that's where I really, as a biblical scholar, started to realize that there is some gray area between biblical scholarship and constructive theology, in that what I find matters to a lot of people. I, early in my career, would say to my students, because this was my training as a biblical scholar, we're going to study this text exactly as we would Homer or, the hymn to Ptah, right? Except that my students, to be fair and to be authentic and real about it, aren't wondering what Ptah thinks about their actions last week, right? And the Iliad isn't scripture for any of my students, right? And so there was a little bit of lack of authenticity in that approach, although I adopted it for a long time. And I got to the point where I started to realize, first of all, when I go to these other interpreters who are reading the same text as I am, using the same tools, and they're talking about what the text said in antiquity, and they're talking about religion, but they're also talking about ecology and maybe the earth or God or animals, meaning non-human animals. They're coming out in a different space than I am. Why? Right? We're coming out in different spaces. And that's where I realized, my experiences, my own theologies, my own religious commitments, my own experiences, they do impact my reading as a biblical scholar. I'm not in a vacuum, like a hermetically sealed space with my historical criticism and my biblical text. They do impact my reading. And then whatever I come up with, what is the proper relationship of humans to non-human animals according to the Hebrew Bible? That matters to people. It matters in the area of theology to people, right? And so that's what I realized. And so that last piece of peace studies, I've come to see some applications as well of the work I'm doing also to conflict resolution and some of the insights of the discipline of peace studies, which is relatively new compared to religious studies and theology, but its own discipline, its own thinkers, and its own applications. And so it's been really good for me to reflect on the title of your school, actually, and to see how it connects lots of pieces of my work. Yeah.
Essentially names all the different transdisciplinary possibilities. And you've given us a bunch of different sort of entry points to your work, I think, and really helpfully. Maybe to jump back a little bit, I mean, your undergraduate degree was in environmental science, and then you went on to do work in ancient Judaism and biblical studies. So,
well, just there, before I went on, I had a crisis because it wasn't just a smooth transition from being an environmental scientist to being an apocalypticism specialist. I was an environmental scientist in Florida, and in my job in Florida, I encountered over and over and over amazing endangered species or vulnerable species, species of special concern. And over my work was put towards plowing them over and making a bank or making the Florida Turnpike. And I really started to feel that we knew about climate change. I knew about it as a undergrad even, all the way back in 1986. That was probably the earliest I'd really heard about the climate crisis and climate change. And they told me by 2020 or 2030, we would be at an inflection point where we had to make a decision about whether human civilization was going to survive, whether all these species were going to survive, and here we are. And so at that point, I went into the study of apocalypticism because I thought it had something to do with the way that people were viewing the earth as a temporary earth. And it didn't feel like a temporary earth to me, and from the point of view of science. And so that's how I actually started with the study of early apocalypticism in Judaism and Christianity in the Greco-Roman world, as far removed as that seems. But
looking at those ancient apocalyptic imaginaries and seeing how they're sort of influencing people in the present. And
I wanted to go back to what I thought the roots of the thinking were that were shaping the society that we're living in. And that particular attitude that the earth is disposable and that we'll get a new one. And I might have just as well have gone back all the way to Persia, but I sort of landed on the early Jewish and the early Christian views, especially the book of Revelation, in shaping all these blind spots and assumptions that we had for thousands of years about whether or not the land outside the garden is sacred, or whether it's a no-God land, right? Whether this earth is temporary, or whether it's really what we've got and where we're going to be, right? Or whether we're going to die, go someplace better, or in a blink of an eye get a whole brand new one, right? So that's why I went into that.
so, I mean, like, there's questions there not just of environment or context, but also the way people's understandings of their ultimate context, however that shapes out, forms their ethical readings of texts or their environmental ethics. I mean, we've mentioned the word apocalypse a few times, and a lot of your scholarship early on was about apocalypse. Could you say that about when you use that word, how are you using it? What kind of features does it have? Is it simply sort of the pyrotechnic end of the world kind of apocalyptic move, or what?
Well, depending on the context, I will use it differently because for a long time I just wanted to change the way everybody was using the word apocalyptic, and that's a fool's errand because it has so much social, not capital, but social value as this term that means it's the end of everything as we know it. It's too big for us to comprehend. It's vast. It's all encompassing. And it's still useful in a way, in that sense. When I was speaking about antiquity, I mean a kind of view of it's also a genre, the apocalypse of John or Revelation. This word apocalypsis from the Greek means an unveiling. It's a revelation, literally. And it tends to be about things about the end time. But it's also about seeing things from a whole different divine vantage point and knowing all kinds of secrets. And this apocalyptic viewpoint that has been relayed in the book of Revelation has been interpreted throughout the last over 1,000 years to mean the end time and some sort of vast change to civilization where all the evil people are punished, all the righteous are rewarded, and now there's a whole new civilization, which is the kingdom of God. Those ideas, whether or not they are within a religious context or even just in a secular society, they permeate our consciousness, especially in the U.S. where I'm from. There was a Pew Center study done, I think it's all the way back from 2014, and it said that 41% of Americans who were surveyed said that Jesus would probably return by 2050. If that is what you are banking on, that's your expectation, why would you invest in any long-term climate change mitigation? Why would you invest in long-term programs of any kind, actually, education, healthcare, etc.? But specifically, if there's going to be short-term cost to investing in switching from fossil fuels to green fuels or in infrastructure, why would you do that if you are convinced that the end of time is in 30 years, right? And so it permeates our modern thinking as well. It's not just, an ancient idea.
And somehow things are going to work out okay.
Right.
We'll either get a new Earth, or technological movements will sort of redeem us somehow, or we'll
Yeah.
get it in there.
It's almost like Elon Musk in the, not to pick on Elon, but, or some other inventor has taken the space in that secular consciousness of this savior figure who's going to swoop in and just invent something and fix everything, right? When you use this sort of climate apocalypse language, which is everywhere, right? It's helpful because it conveys, yeah, this is big, this is vast, it's going to affect a lot of people. But it's also, I think, really damaging because it means that the problem is too big for us to fix. Some miraculous person is going to fix it, right? It's not a matter of all of us changing our lifestyles and this like grassroots activism and lots of people seeing things differently and all of us getting off fossil fuels, which we're supposed to do completely by 2050. It's not a matter of that. It's a matter of someone swooping in to fix it, right? And there's one, let me say one more thing, and I'm not sure where we're going with this, which is exciting, but the other thing that's problematic to me about it, other than just waiting for someone else to do it, is when we think about climate apocalypse, it so emphasizes the end time in a way that resonates with our historical memory that tells us the righteous will be saved. And I just heard this wonderful indigenous ethnobotanist, Rosalind Lapierre, speaking in a workshop, and she said, It is not true that humans cause climate change. Some humans cause climate change. And the humans that didn't cause climate change, like from the least developed industrial nations and indigenous peoples, will suffer disproportionately, right? And so that's not quite right. And so to say, and it'll affect us all, also isn't quite right. And so in that apocalyptic formula of, you know, the wicked will be punished, the innocent will be saved, it's exactly the opposite in an ecological, you know, quote-unquote apocalypse. It's exactly the opposite. Because the people who have the most financial means and who benefited from the previous civilizational patterns who got us into this situation will be able to do something and provide for themselves, migrate, etc. Yeah.
There's something exciting about the trajectory of your scholarship here, because there's this sense in which you have an existential experience of witnessing environmental devastation. You go to study biblical texts and this particular historical genre of an ancient kind of influence on the present, and one that now has these multiple sort of Musk and Bezos and sort of different kinds of technological forms, and bringing it to bear on this issue of climate change, which is something that isn't something that's occurred solely within our own lifetimes, right? That it's a development of forms of climate injustice that are in the emergence of colonialism, in the histories of the Industrial Revolution, in all of these different historical movements that exceed our own lifetimes, and then will be the effects of that be here long after we're dead and gone. And so there's something actually about the way you're talking about ancient texts that taps into that sense that there's these histories matter for thinking about these contemporary ethical problems, because it's not just about sort of finding the quick fix solution. It's about actually examining these deep tectonic plates of history.
Right. Another way that I would put what you just said is that if we don't have a deep moment of introspection about how we got here, a really deep reckoning with how do we understand our relationship to the rest of the, I love the phrase that you tend to use, the more than human world, right? Other animals. We're just going to replicate the same kind of patterns that got us here. And so that's really why I'm so drawn to indigenous theologies and some other theologies that have been not at the center of the work of interpreting the Bible in order to bring new ideas to these texts, even as I'm trying to go back with these tools of linguistics and historical criticism to look at the text completely in a new way to say, what does it say? And what I find is it just doesn't say what I think a whole bunch of interpreters have been saying that it says for hundreds and hundreds, maybe 1,000 years.
So maybe walk us through what are some of those stories that are told about or used with biblical languages that sort of impact environmental crises?
Well, this approach, I'm really trying to think about it, and I just kind of walked us through it a little bit, but there's another piece of doing what I'm thinking of myself as an ecological theology, thinking of myself as an animal, reading an artifact created by other human animals, right? Trying to understand something that is more than my species. And so to just keep that in mind, right? Just to keep that in mind, because, for instance, Xenophanes has this great quote, if cows and horses had hands and could draw, a cow would draw a god that looked like a cow, and a horse would draw a god that looks like a horse. So even starting from that viewpoint and noticing, yeah, sometimes the Bible describes God sort of in a human way, but most of the time does not. And most of the time actually works against that. And so this idea of humans being created in the image of God. I realize that in our interpretation, we're not starting with the portrayal of God that's throughout the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and then saying, what does that mean for us as humans? We're starting with our idea of being human. Oop, I think we're getting feedback. We're starting with our idea of being human, and then using that to construct our idea of God, right? God is described in the Hebrew Bible as rock, as wind, as air, as water, as darkness, as infinite darkness, as darkness that radiates light. And then even if you turn to how God is described in terms of animals, yes, a little bit of the human animal sometimes, really a real sliver of the time, and much more frequently as horses, as cows, as sheep, as serpent, as lion, as eagle. I could think of so many examples. And we tend, when we read these texts, to put ourselves so much in the center that we can't even see what it's saying. Because I think that the ancient authors were in I'm going to use your term, Jake's term, planetary intimacy. They had an intimacy with their environment and with the non-human animals in their lives that so many of us do not, as we're sitting looking at that text and we're in our air-conditioned box or our heated box, eating a snack that we just unwrapped from plastic, looking at these texts. It's a different kind of self and embodiment and relationship with the wider world than those ancient authors had, so we miss it. We just miss it. In the Psalms, God is described as Father 4 times. And God is described as rock 28 times. And we tend to take Father as literal because we understand it. And we take rock as a metaphor because we don't understand it and it doesn't fit a non-Indigenous interpreter's viewpoint. It fits an Indigenous interpreter's viewpoint, right? There are mountains in New Zealand that have rights, right, and that are considered family to Indigenous persons, looking at our New Zealander, and rivers that have rights in New Zealand, right, because of the Indigenous advocacy for these as parts of their family. So to a non-Indigenous interpreter, that's a metaphor. But what was it to an ancient Israelite? And I think that some of these other theologies get closer to what it was. When Deuteronomy says, Israel, you've forgotten God, comma, rock, comma, the one who bore you. That seems pretty literal, pretty straightforward. So I'm trying to go back literally to those linguistics and ask, what did they have in mind? Yeah.
There's something really beautiful about that in the sense that it's that you're taking these ancient peoples more seriously.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Than a lot of folks do in their contemporary context, like linking into institutional forms of religiosity. And so there's a way in which you're sort of breaking up and showing us in these ancient biblical texts that are also formative for many folks' worldviews and ethical worldviews in the present, that actually there are other ways of seeing divinity or responsibilities to the earth. I think of the environmental ethicist Holmes Rollston has this great line where he says most folks tend to imagine that the Bible, whether in their personal life or their projection onto the Bible, that the Bible is some sort of book of science and that you can sort of interpret a contemporary scientific worldview out of it mistakenly, or that it's not relevant to the present at all. You can push it away or pull it way too close. And he said, but if you're thinking and taking these ancient people seriously, they knew their ecologies as a native range and used that to make meaning. And so picking that up for us brings up different kinds of possibilities for an encounter. And I know that that's been a huge part of your project. You've been talking about your project is thinking about climate covenant as a possible move for ethics. So could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, what it means, how, is it are you talking about the historical relationships, or is it something that we should be taking on in our contemporary ethics, or how do you imagine that?
Well, first and foremost, I go to the text. I, by training, am a biblical scholar. So I go to the text to say, what is here? I don't ever want to overinterpret the text or rescue it or make it too pretty or anything else. What it says is what it says. But what I find when I try to go to the text and I try to think in these ways that you're referring to more seriously about what the ancient authors' experience was, right? What was their intimacy with wilderness? What was their intimacy with weather as an agrarian society, right? What was their relationship with these other non-human animals that they're writing about, right? Was it unusual for Balaam and the donkey to be talking to each other and for the donkey to be talking back? We think, oh, look at that magical donkey. But the text doesn't say, oh, and then this really bizarre thing happened. The donkey could, speak, or the serpent could speak. The serpent's just speaking, right? And in the indigenous cultures with which I work, like for instance, Pacifica theologies, I'm thinking specifically of a Samoan biblical scholar named Brian Poliak, who was speaking about the serpent and Eve story and just paused in his presentation and said, and then they spoke to each other, which is normal. It's normal to speak to animals and for animals to speak back. That's not the remarkable part of the story. And then it just continued. What just happened, right? So I am trying to take that really seriously, right? And so your question was about weather. What I find is that weather is everywhere. It's foundational to the covenant. And where this matters is that people who don't read the Bible but claim, I will say people who don't read the Bible well, but claim that the Bible is somehow denying that climate change can be caused by humans or that we have any responsibility, that those voices have shaped U.S. policy on climate change. Our actual policy has been shaped by people saying, by senators saying, the Bible speaks against human-induced climate change. And again, I think that's bad reading, right? So when I look at this covenant, I see a setup, kind of a system that's established within this larger divine ecosystem that's introduced in Genesis 1, this whole divine ecosystem that's interrelated, got all these parts. I see a covenant that's based on saying if humans obey these rules, then you have wonderful weather and all kinds of fertility. And if you don't, then you have terrible weather and infertility. And not only you suffer, but the earth suffers, which is personified in these texts, and animals suffer, and that's how the system's set up. So it's actually a different kind of system entirely than that Senator Jim Hindenhoff was claiming, right? Entirely different. In his book, The Greatest Hoax on Climate Change. Anyways.
Yeah, but this, I mean, maybe phrase it like this, that it sounds like what you're saying is that in these ancient texts, there's some recognition that social relationships have ecological impacts in a bigger way than we can imagine. And maybe that's insight not just for folks who claim the religious traditions, but it's actually something for that everyone can kind of intuit. And then on top of that, you're offering a counter political narrative almost to the one that's shaped a lot of U.S. policy around climate, and that is to say that for those folks who, for lack of a better term, weaponize the Bible into forms of climate denial, that you're actually saying, that's a bad reading.
That's right.
And not only that, but that there's a stronger reading that might even have more political saliency, maybe? Like, where are you going to run with it? Like, do you want people to suddenly take up, oh yes, climate covenant is a biblical idea, and get involved in politics or something like that?
Well, to be clear,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's definitely feedback here.
Divine.
To be clear, should I keep speaking? Are we okay on sound? I think that's okay there. Okay, that's okay? Okay. To be clear, I do not think that the Bible should be used to form public policy in a democracy that has more than one viewpoint, is not just Christian, is not just Jewish and Christian, and it's a pluriform democracy. And so to be a democracy, I don't think it should be used to form public policy. But that means that if a senator who sways the vote on climate change, as he did, by claiming that he speaks for the Bible, and then he has a terrible reading of the Bible, that we as biblical scholars should speak up and say, no, that's a terrible reading of the Bible, and should not form this policy. So it has political implications, but I'm not advocating that the Bible be injected even more than it is in U.S. politics, because there are a lot of things that are problematic. Not to mention the fact that those laws include things like, stoning a disobedient son, or et cetera. I mean, I would not want those things to become the laws of the United States. So I'm both trying to say, in an ancient context, this is how they understood it, but I'm also trying to say there are implications for those who see this as scripture, right? And if the implications are, we exist in a divine ecosystem in which we have limits placed upon us in the original intent. We have responsibilities. We exist in balance with other species. We're the keystone species that can throw everything out of whack, but we have responsibilities. And the way that that's articulated is that the climate profoundly changes when we don't live up to our responsibilities. I think that's the lesson that could be taken as a theological lesson that's relevant, very relevant for this unique point that we're at, in which we have 3 to 8 years to steer the course of the future of our planet, about which I could say more. But.
Well, I hope you will. I think that harkens back to where we sort of began in some ways, thinking about what is this study of religion, theology, peace studies thing, and I think hopefully what you're saying is in being a scholar of religion, being a scholar of biblical studies, there's this public scholarly role
That's right.
For holding certain kinds of conversations accountable or more historically wise into the present, and so maybe you've been doing this research project here, and I know that you had some interest in Ireland specifically too, as to how some of these things sort of impact or are lived in certain scholarship, and you have this other project. If you wouldn't mind going into the BioEarth project
sure.
a little bit, because
Yes.
I think it's an embodiment of your scholarship in a different kind of way.
Yeah, no, thank you, because I have seen myself more and more as having this more impactful role, simply out of a feeling of calling, to be honest. I just feel a responsibility. We're living at a point, as I said, where the latest IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, that's coming out in September, is telling us we only have 3 to 8 years to steer the course. In reality, the target of reducing our emissions by half within 8 years and coming to net carbon zero emissions in 30 years is probably not going to happen. It's probably not going to happen. And so I started a nonprofit organization that is taking the point of view that some impacts from climate change are coming our way, period. BioEarth is trying to promote both ecological resiliency but also societal resiliency. We're expected to have between 250 million and 1 billion climate migrants within 30 years. By the end of the century, on the present course we're on, which I do hope we do change, but on the present course that we're on, the habitable zones of the world will be about at the US-Canadian border for us Americans, and then northern France and above, or Antarctica for this part of the world. So that right now is the legacy that we're preparing to leave our children and our children's children I don't even know about. And so I just felt like I needed to, in addition to the scholarship I'm doing, do something to work for some environmental education. And what I found is, and I found this actually through my work in terrorism, which you mentioned before, but counterterrorism studies, which I got to through apocalypticism, had made me realize that security itself needed a redefinition. So backing up a little bit, but in security studies or in counterterrorism studies, security is understood in physical, material ways. But everything that I found that wasn't a sustainable solution was unsustainable because people hadn't taken into account the psychological impact of whatever measures they were taking, the cultural impact, the religious impact, and the ecological impact. And so this led me to a definition of peace that I was using back when I was doing that kind of work in countering violent extremism, in which peace, to be sustainable, involves the physical, the material, the psychological, and the cultural and religious, and the ecological well-being of all peoples. And so any project that you're involved in, whether it be a farm, or whether it be a business, or whether it be environmental education, or whatever it may be at all, to think about it systemically, and you can use your hand to do it because there's 5 parts, is really helpful in saying, is this, for the long haul, sustainable? We think so much in terms of 5 years or 10 years, right? Is this sustainable? And then also, if there's conflict, we can't have the kind of broad grassroots mobilization that's necessary to make these civilizational changes that we have to make in order to deal with the climate change that's coming, the climate crisis. It's going to take broad cooperation, not one magical person swooping in. What we saw in COVID, okay, is that governments, we can work together, but it takes a long time. We only do so up to a point. The idea that suddenly we're all going to get on the same page and figure this out, you know, and rescue ourselves, because we're not really rescuing the earth, it's going to survive, but rescue ourselves, right? And rescue some of these animals. It's not very reasonable, in my opinion. It's not very logical. We'll still keep working for it. It's important. I will put all of my heart into that. But we have to also have mass understanding of this, grassroots understanding of this, and we have to work together to at least agree on a goal of peace. We're going to disagree on how we get there. If we can't even say, this is our goal, how are we going to get through this moment of crisis in human civilization? I'm not sure that we can. So the 1 billion for peace pledge, am I allowed to give the website for that? Okay, at www.bioearthcommunity.com. The 1 billion for peace pledge is nonpartisan. It's not related to a particular faith commitment or a particular nationality. And we're trying to get as many people as possible just to use this intention setting tool to say, I'm just committing to peace. That's all. I'm committing to peace in these 5 facets. That's it. I won't always make it. We're going to disagree on how to get there, right? But I'm committing to that. And then in addition to that, we're trying to do education and live sustainably in what will be sort of an eco-village, we're calling a bio-village, because we all who are involved in this organization have to have some place to live. And I hope that that will be very sustainable and very inspiring for my other work that we were talking about in this book.
I think as scholars who respond or take up the challenge of thinking about our ecological context or the climate crises of our time, suddenly feel compelled to, or recognize that every aspect of what we do as scholars and even the ethical responses that we make in daily living somehow all need to respond to this. And so it sounds to me like you're relearning how to read history with environmental eyes. You're learning how to rework some of the poetry that impacts everyone's everyone who engages in Jewish and Christian practices, religious imaginations. And then you're doing this work that is also related, which is actually your own embodied practice, which I think then sort of feeds back into what you see in the text potentially.
You're so right. It is very much, it has been an introspective journey for me. Appearances to the contrary, am an introvert. I would much rather not be in front of the camera. I would much rather just be writing books, having people read books, and having somehow, miraculously, all this great change happen. I've had to learn that we can reach an audience through social media, that my work that I wanted to keep just in the academy is important to people, and how we're going to face this climate crisis together. And that's required being more vulnerable and more open in public about, how I'm living. Am I a vegetarian? Am I not a vegetarian? It depends on when you ask me. Am I living the most sustainable life that I can? Right now I'm in a suburb and my house is going through renovation, and I'm just fighting with the kind of tools that are at my disposal, and it's been miserable. So I didn't, I wasn't just like birthed in a yurt and then just created this beautiful, ecologically green building that I write everything from. I'm writing on a computer with minerals mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo by little children, and that place is incredibly important to the future of climate because it has the second largest rainforest in the whole world. So the fact that that's how I'm engaging, there's a violence that I have to admit to. There's a vulnerability that I have to become comfortable with, and a willingness to give myself grace for all my mistakes, right? Yeah.
Is it sort of like acknowledging your sort of vulnerability as a scholar or complicity as a scholar as a starting point then?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because certainly as I began in this talk to describe, I would say the majority of biblical scholars are not going to begin their book with, a self-disclosure about even their religious commitments or how they grew up or their relationship to the more than human world. Right now, and I might change it, but right now the preface to my book and the title's just changed thanks to our conversations. How about this? Between all things, the climate covenant.
Yeah.
You like that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so it's been developing in our conversations. Thank you. And, but right now the preface starts with, I am an animal. That's just where I start. I'm trying to do an ecological reading that just keeps remembering, oh yeah, I'm an animal. Now how do I read this, right? And, that can seem a little navel-gazily in the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion.
Or kind of romantic or precious.
Yes,
like,
and over-sentimentalizing. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But, I don't have time. I've got to write it that way now. Oh, speaking of time.
Go for questions at all?
I have a question that's come in. How do you address the punitive biblical reading of the environment as the vengeance of floods and droughts, etc., in your rereading of the Apocalypse discourse? And that's from Eve.
Yes. how do I address that nasty side of weather? I think looking at it as a biblical scholar, that's sort of exactly the point. That weather is not this friendly thing that we tame and we control, and we live in our climate controlled boxes, and we have air conditioning, and we have heat, and then if it gets too hot, we do this. No, that the ancient authors very much understood it can get out of control. It can be devastating. That story is very interesting. That Eve brought that up, quite perspicacious of Eve, because Senator Inhofe, I'm really not trying to focus on him today, he was coming up in my mind. In his book, The Climate Hoax, had quoted something from that story as his evidence for his claim that the Bible does not believe in human-induced climate change. The quote is the one that says, "For as long as there is day and night, summer and winter," right? Then, the earth will endure. And it is such a poor reading, because it's literally about a story in which God looked at humankind and said, the evil in their heart is so profound, I'm going to start over. And I'm going to get rid of most of these people, almost all of them, and the animals suffer as a result, which God seems sorry for later, but at that time, God, at that point in God's journey, says, oh, they will suffer too. And then there's this punishing flood, and then there's this boat that saves just the tiniest fraction of them, which we over-sentimentalize to the point of making a nursery theme. It's the worst nursery theme on the planet. Everything that's outside of a boat is dead and floating in the water, unless it's, possibly the fish. We won't get into that. But everything else is dead, right? So it's this terrible story of climate destruction, and God using that as a tool, right, to say, no, this is terrible. The way that this civilization is going is absolutely terrible, and I'm going to start over. So when I look at that, I see the text being open to a possibility that God will start over. God says that God will not destroy the earth again by flood. First of all, the covenant with the rainbow is made with not just humans, it's made with the earth, it's made with animals, and it's made with humans, to say not every living thing will die. That's not that comforting. Great. Thanks. Rainbow nursery theme, right? Not every living thing will be wiped out, and it won't be in this specific way. So it does open itself up to that kind of theology. Now, as I take it into a contemporary setting, I am very wary that there are those who would use it in an uncritical way to say, see, that hurricane caused by God. That volcanic eruption caused by God. Why? Because of sin. Because of sin. Right? I think that that's also a misreading. It's a misreading because this was, even in the point of view of the biblical story, an epic moment of restarting all of civilization, right? Which I'm still going to say that text is saying that's God's right. God could do it, right? But then also a reckoning of the suffering that happens, because at the end, God makes this covenant and seems especially moved by the fact that the animals suffered, and seems to specifically say, oh, I'm not going to wipe out all these animals, all flesh, because now I know that humans incline towards evil. Now I know that, right? I know as a process theologian, you work with this text a lot. What's your favorite part of that text? That's a hard question.
Yeah, no, it's a hard question. Well, I mean that kind of that sense in which the question about divine power is one thing that folks come up with a lot, and the question that Eve raised about providence and God sort of working in retributive ways. And when I read, when you read those texts, God's kind of a bit of a fumbler, like in those. That's the sort of all-powerful deity who can do everything and seems to know everything, just doesn't exist in that text.
Right.
And the fact that God sort of learns a little bit is one thing, and I wouldn't take that necessarily to be a sort of modern sense of it.
Well, it's not a criticism. I mean,
No.
it takes seriously what the text says,
Yeah.
because God is learning. It says, and God was grieved to his heart.
Yes.
And again, when I say that, how many of us just pictured a man?
Yeah.
But it doesn't say like a human
Doesn't say,
heart.
yeah.
But God was grieved to his heart, right?
Mhm.
Because of humans that he
Yeah.
created. And they were evil, right? And they were inclined towards evil. And so God gets sorry. God's learning. God seems disappointed over and over and over. I mean, the first person that he rescued was Noah, and then Noah's terrible after this story.
Yeah,
He's
right.
terrible, gets drunk. I'm not even going to tell you that story.
Yeah.
But terrible. So God just seems really continuously disappointed. I'm like, really? I really thought that this would solve it?
Yeah.
But getting back to Eve's question real quickly, that is a sort of epic, huge event. Within that, the system that's set up is that climate covenant, right?
Yeah.
So on a smaller scale, and the climate just sort of, it's almost a little bit more removed from God. Like the climate just responds.
Yeah.
You're going to have drought, you're going to have flood, you're going to have fertility, you're going to have nice weather, you're going to have terrible weather, depending on how humans behave. And so, barring that one example of that huge punitive flood, the climate covenant seems to be in place. And the place where I might see that God interacts in it is weather has to do with wind, has to do with God, and that is Ruach, the Spirit of God. Same word, wind, Spirit, Ruach. So God is between all things in that climate covenant. But anyways.
There's this sense in which reading these biblical stories, again, is really in public spaces peeling back a lot of the assumptions that are layered across. Even the rainbow in that story, right? We tend to think of the lovely bow, but it's putting down a battle bow, of a war bow, right? This sort of, or of some ways.
Right. Again, not a nursery thing.
Not a nursery thing, yeah.
Not a nursery
Yeah,
thing.
but God might be some sort of warrior with a rainbow bow and arrow kind of mode. So this doesn't always translate in contemporary ways in the past.
There's another question? Do we have time for another?
One very quick one.
Yeah.
Okay.
You started to answer this already, but just about the public scholarly role and like combating misreadings and misinterpretations, a lot of folks would see that as like a matter of opinion, your reading versus senator. You know what I mean? Because we live in the soundbite culture. And even folks who didn't necessarily read that senator's book would take his opinion. You know what I mean? So in as quick a way as you can, how do we combat that?
That's absolutely why I ground this in biblical scholarship. I want to say that I'm trying to do the most faithful, I would actually say literal, reading of what is in that text, because I myself can make it say whatever I want, sure, somebody else can, but where biblical scholarship plays a role is to say, is that what the text says? Do the words support that? Does it actually say that? You know? Does it actually say that God created man to be above women? Or no. It says, and God created humankind in God's image, male and female, right? And in fact, Adam, this first earthling, does not seem to be male at all, and is Adam from Adamah, earthling from earth, and is this like soil creature, this, right? This thing that comes out of the living soil, and then is split, right? And so just any reading that it can be, right? I hear all the time, the Bible is against abortion. The Bible says that marriage is only between a man and a woman. The Bible says that there can be no human-induced climate change. As a biblical scholar, I actually do not see this at all. And we can talk about each of those, but that's for another time. So you have to go back to the text, and you have to go back to the evidence if that's going to be what you're grounding and claiming. You have to go back to it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think some of your other work too answers that as well, is that it's the biblical scholar and marshaling these kinds of communal energies to begin to do the slow work of transformation of these kinds of things. Because it's making a simple rational argument about what the Bible says or not might do some work for some folks, but it might not always make that transformation happen.
Yeah, and that, I'm really glad you said that, because my answer was incomplete. It isn't just those who know biblical Hebrew, and that's something I am always worried about, actually, because I think that if you're going to stand up in the floor of the Senate and say this, then I'm going to combat it as a biblical scholar. But the point that a reader helps create this meaning cannot be forgotten, because some of the greatest insights that I've seen are by people who are untrained. You know, the Pacifica Sunday schools that I know Yoni Habea has led, in which people who are untrained but are reading the text in a fresh way have this amazing conclusion about the text and point out something I haven't even seen, right? All of those readings need to be honored and need to be welcomed. I think where it becomes problematic is when you have somebody who is using the Bible, hasn't read it well, isn't very knowledgeable about it, and they're wielding their power. That's where it becomes problematic for me. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to sort of come to a conclusion. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you. I am so glad that we could conduct this in a way, and this was my wish, that showed some of the conversations that we've been having over the last 6 weeks, because they've been just so fantastic, and I wanted people to have a taste of what we sit around and think about together, associated with the Hub, because every single week let me scratch that idea. Bringing that scratching is fantastic. At some point I'll just have to write the book. But,
the scholarship is that kind of collaboration that does that long work. For me too, I'm very grateful to have you, and grateful for the place that offered that kind of conversation. So.
I'm grateful.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Gotcha.